Hi class, in this video we are going over thinking and intelligence. And for this one we are focusing on thinking. We are not going to be focusing on some other factors of thinking like concepts or schema. So only what we cover here is what you could see on the test. But in general, this is the cognition chapter. And cognition is thinking. It's a fancy way to say thinking. It covers a lot of things. Perception, which we talked about in chapter 5, knowledge, problem solving, judgment, language, memory, and intelligence. And cognitive psychology is the field that is connected with this. Again, for this chapter, we are going to talk about problem solving and intelligence. Those are the two things we are going to talk about connected with this. First, we'll do problem solving. Problem solving is ways to solve problems. You're generally going to use a problem-solving strategy, which is a plan of action used to find a solution. There are several types of problem-solving strategies. You can use trial and error, which is when you just keep trying new things until you find out one that works. You can use an algorithm, which is a formula that provides you with step-by-step instructions used to achieve a desired outcome. And so an example of an algorithm is if you're making a bookcase from IKEA and you are following those pictures in that direction guide step by step. You know, if you go through and follow each picture in order, you are going to get a good bookcase at the end. If you decide to make chocolate chip cookies and you get out that recipe from online and you are following it step by step by step, you're going to get some good cookies at the end if you follow that order. So the good part about algorithms is that they are effective. They give you the correct solution. The downside to algorithms is that they can be time consuming. It can take a while if you are following that step by step by step. Another problem-solving strategy is a heuristic. It's a general problem-solving framework. There are a few types of heuristics that we will get into on the next slide. But for this, know that in general, a good part about heuristics is that they're fast. You get the solution a lot more quickly than when you use an algorithm. However, the downside to heuristics is that they are prone to error. You are less likely to get the correct solution if you are using a heuristic rather than an algorithm. Finally, another way you can solve a problem is working backwards. So you begin by solving a problem by focusing on the end result. An example of this is if you know you have to be at BWI at noon, when do you need to leave? That's going to be working backwards. Here's what I need to get at the end, being at BWI at noon. So when do I need to leave to make that happen based on traffic? That's working backwards. Again, we're going to get into types of heuristics because they tend to be part of pitfalls of problem solving because remember, they are prone to error. But before we get into the specific types of heuristics, some other pitfalls. One is mental sets. This is when you persist in approaching a problem in a way that has worked in the past but is clearly not working now. And so this is an example of a mental set is when you're trying to, it's a good mental set. You're trying to open your dorm room and you're trying to get your key to work, but it's not working. But every other time you've done it, you've put the key in and turned and it's worked. So you just keep trying the same thing over and over. You need to step back. you need to reevaluate because this method is not going to work this time. That's one common pitfall. Another one is functional fixedness. Functional fixedness is a type of mental set where you can't perceive an object being used for something other than what it was designed for. You can't think outside of the box. So sort of the famous example of this is an experiment where they gave people a box of matches, or a box, what did they give them? A box of matches, a few tacks, and a candle. And they said, you need to have this candle and attached to the wall. You need to have it off of the table and lit. Go. And so people would take a match from the box and they would like try to light the side of the candle and then stick it to the wall, and it was too heavy, it wouldn't work. Or they try to use the tacks to tack the candle to the wall, but the tacks aren't thick enough, long enough, so that wouldn't work. They'd be really stuck when the solution is you dump the matches out of the box, you use the tacks to attach the matchbox to the wall, and then you stick the candle in that matchbox. But when you think about a matchbox, you think about it as something that holds matches. You don't think about it as a candlestick holder. They couldn't think about it in a new way. Problem solving. Anchoring bias is when you focus on one piece of information when making a decision or solving a problem, and you ignore everything else. For example, if you're deciding when you need to go to BWI and you think, it's a Sunday, I don't have to worry about traffic because there's never traffic on Sundays. But you don't think about the fact that it's Easter Sunday. And yeah, there's going to be traffic on an Easter Sunday. You're only focusing on this one thing. I don't see traffic on Sundays, and you don't focus on other factors like, is there something special about this Sunday? And then confirmation bias is the tendency to focus on information that confirms your existing belief. If you think something is true, you are only going to focus on that. You're not going to see all the other information that shows that your solution is not accurate. So an example of this is, what's a good example of this? An example of this is if you're deciding how risky it is to be around someone you know was just diagnosed with COVID, and you think everyone I know who was vaccinated, who got COVID, they were fine, it was no big deal. So that means it's fine. And you seek out whenever you see someone who was fine because they were vaccinated and got COVID, you're like, see, look, it proves I'm right. You're not going to try to find the cases where someone still got really sick, maybe not hospitalized, since vaccines do cut down on that, but, was pretty miserable for a few days. You're not going to listen to those stories because that doesn't prove what you think is true. Or a common example of this is during elections, where you are going to seek out polls that prove your candidate is doing well. You're going to ignore the polls that show that maybe your candidate's not doing so awesome because it doesn't confirm what you want to think. Okay, now one more bias, and then we'll get into the two types of heuristic, because your book calls it representative bias. I consider that a type of heuristic. But first, hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is when you believe the event that you just experienced was predictable, even when it really wasn't. This is the Monday morning quarterback idea. The famous example of this has to do with football. The 1985 Super Bowl was between the 49ers and the Dolphins. And before the Super Bowl, the researchers who did this, Brigham, I think was his name. Brigham, you don't need to know it. Anyways, John Brigham did this experiment, and they asked people, who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl? And this was back when the Dolphins were a good team. And so the majority of people said the Dolphins. 81% of people said, I think the Dolphins are going to win this Super Bowl. And 40% of people said, I think it's going to be the Dolphins by at least 10 points. So 81% Dolphins, 40% by at least 10 points. The 49ers won the Super Bowl. 2 weeks later, Brigham went back to the participants and said, do you remember what you told us? Who did you say was going to win the Super Bowl? And what happened was 81% had said it was going to be the Dolphins. 58% of people remembered saying 49ers. And nobody remembered saying Dolphins by 10, even though it had been 40. This is the hindsight bias. After the fact, after you know who won, it's easy to misremember what you thought beforehand. Again, you also see this a lot in politics. After there is an upset of some sort, you convince yourself that it was obvious the whole time. Like, for example, in 2016, after Trump won the election, when most people assumed it was going to be Clinton. After the fact, which first of all, it's kind of confirmation bias that people were assuming that. They were looking at the factors that they thought were going to prove that and ignoring things that didn't confirm that. But after the fact, everyone was going back and saying, of course, look at this, look at that. It was totally obvious Trump was going to win. No, because the day of the election, y'all, I don't know if you're old enough that you were paying a lot of attention that day. The day of the election, everyone assumed it was going to be Clinton, but it wasn't. After the fact, everyone said, of course, it was going to be Trump. That's hindsight bias. Okay, final two are also types of heuristics. Representative, sometimes called representativeness heuristic or bias, and then the availability heuristic. The representative one is when you unintentionally stereotype someone or something. So you have sort of this image, this representative in your head, and you think, how much does this match what's in my head? And then you kind of go with it. So again, stereotypes are a good example of this. Or in the original Men in Black movie, when they're going through this course where they have to shoot the bad guys, but they need to make sure they don't shoot the good people, the bystanders. And they like shoot something that looks like an alien, and they don't shoot something that looks like a grandma. And in the end, it was just a sweet little alien, but the grandma was really a bad guy in disguise. That's representative heuristic. No one thinks grandma's the bad guy, and so you don't act maybe the way you should. Availability heuristic is when you make a decision based on an example or information. What's most available in your memory is the way I think about it. And even if that's not the most common. How easy is it for something to come to mind? That is how you decide how common it is. For example, oh gosh, what's a good example of this? When COVID, sort of like in the first 6 months of COVID, my parents were going to fly. And my parents are, in their 70s. They have other risk factors. They are high risk for having complications with COVID. And this was before there was a vaccine. And so they were going to go fly. I had heard about an epidemiologist who had caught COVID on a plane, even though he was wearing a mask because it got through his eyeballs or something like that. And I remember being like, you have to wear goggles on the plane because you're going to get COVID through your eyeballs. There might be a couple of people who have caught COVID through their eyeballs. That is not a common way to get it. It is not a likely thing to happen. But it was an example that was easy for me to come to mind because I just read a news story about this guy catching COVID through his eyeballs. And so in my mind, I thought it was a lot more likely than it actually was. Or this is people who are afraid of flying, even though it's a lot more dangerous to drive. A huge airplane crash that kills a couple hundred people is going to make the news a lot more than a car crash. And so we think that flying is more dangerous than it actually is. and we don't think driving is as dangerous as it is. That's that availability heuristic. And that is it for problem solving. The final thing I want to do connected with that before we get into intelligence is just go over. So we've talked about those last couple of pitfalls for problem solving, or really types of heuristics. I don't know why that says working backwards here. We already talked about that. So when are you more likely to use a heuristic versus using an algorithm? Even though we know heuristics are more prone to problems. When there's just too much information, you cannot sift through everything before you make your decision. If you don't have a lot of time to make your decision, like if it's just in the moment, you can't analyze all the facts. If it's not really important, if you don't think it's a big deal, you're not going to waste the time to look through all the options. If you don't have a lot of information to make the decision, like if you just have to think of a decision off the top of your head, and if the appropriate heuristic happens to come to mind in the moment before you think through everything else, that is when you are most likely to do it. Okay, final thing we're going to go over in this chapter is intelligence. Intelligence, there's lots of different ways to think about intelligence. We're going to start by talking about a couple of intelligence theorists and how they characterized it. Spearman was one of the first people to create a theory of intelligence, and he thought intelligence consisted of one general factor, what he thought of as the G factor, so your general factor of intelligence. He also had S factors, specific areas of intelligence, but your book doesn't go as into those. So using the G factor, it could be measured and you could compare people. You have a higher G factor than this other person, you're more intelligent. Cattell thought that that G factor, that general intelligence, really had two components: crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is acquired knowledge and your ability to retrieve it. These are the people who are great at trivia nights. They just know a lot of facts. These are the people that are doing awesome at Jeopardy. Fluid intelligence is processing speed. It is your ability to see complex relationships, solve problems. In the developmental chapter, we'll talk a little bit about this. Crystallized intelligence continues to go up throughout your lifetime. Fluid intelligence goes down when you're older. For example, someone with high fluid intelligence would solve a Sudoku puzzle really fast. Grandma's not doing Sudoku as fast as you because her fluid intelligence is lower. Next, we have Sternberg. Sternberg's theory of intelligence says there are three components to intelligence. And you need all three of these to have oh gosh, what was his phrase for it? Basically, to be intelligent, you need three components. And I put them in this order because the way I remember them is your thinking cap, C-A-P. But however you want to remember it, go for it. You have creative intelligence. This is when you can find novel solutions to problems. You can find problems no one had, find solutions no one could find. You have analytical intelligence. This is what you would think of as book smarts. So this is academic problem solving. You can analyze, evaluate, compare, and contrast. This is what we tend to measure in schools. And then you have practical intelligence. Another way to say this would be street smarts. So you can find solutions in your everyday life. And so Sternberg says that we overemphasize analytical intelligence at school, and we don't focus enough on practical intelligence or creative intelligence, which is sad because once you're out of school, these other types of intelligence matter as well. For example, who cares if you're awesome at calculus if you can't go to the grocery store and find the best deal on paper towels? That's going to be practical intelligence. Or for example, if you are going to get a PhD in psychology, you have to do research. You have to have high creative intelligence. Your dissertation is basically you finding a problem no one else has solved and then designing an experiment and solving it. That's creative intelligence. And so if getting through your bachelor's and getting into grad school is just based on analytical intelligence, it's not necessarily setting you up for success. And so that's why, for example, if you're going to apply to a PhD program, regardless of the field, psychology or something else, oftentimes you'll have to write a statement on what you want to research. And that's sort of their way at getting at, do you have creative intelligence? So for example, I have okay analytical intelligence, but it not so great. I didn't get an A my first year of college. Oh well. And so when I was applying for grad schools, for PhD programs, a lot of my classmates who were also applying thought it was hilarious that I thought I could get into a PhD program in psychology because I wasn't even in the top 10 for psychology students at my college. I was, I did well in a lot of my psychology classes, but again, not the most amazing student because I didn't have great analytical intelligence, but I have creative intelligence. I was able to see things in new ways. And so I got into a few PhD programs, and I was the only student at my school that year that got into a PhD program, and they were all shocked. But that's because it matters more than just analytical. Your creative intelligence, practical intelligence matters in the real world. And so, for example, that's one reason I do perusals for part of your grade. That's getting at more than your analytical intelligence. Can you apply what's in this video or article to the real world? The creative, can you think about it in a novel way? If you take my social psychology class, a big chunk of the final is actually a creative intelligence component. And so there are always some students who aced a lot of the multiple choice tests all semester who don't do well on that part because they might have analytical intelligence, but they don't have high creative intelligence. And there's always some students who struggled on the multiple choice test during the semester who ace that part of the final because they have high creative intelligence. And that's kind of one of the reasons I add this, because if you're going to be a psychologist, you need more than analytical intelligence. So Sternberg's big thing is that you need more than just one type emphasized in school. And by the way, the name for this is the triarchic theory of intelligence. It's his triarchic theory. Next type, Gardner. Gardner has his theory of multiple intelligence. He says there are 8 different types: linguistic, language; logical, mathematical, you'd be good at math or a good lawyer; musical, bodily, kinesthetic, you'd be a good dancer or athlete; spatial, you can see things in 3D, you'd be a good architect or pilot; interpersonal, you're good at understanding relationships between people, you'd be a good therapist; intrapersonal, you understand yourself well, you'd be a good motivational speaker; and then naturalist, you've got a green thumb, you'd be a good farmer, biologist. There is some debate on this. Some people say it's more cognitive styles than distinct types of intelligence. It's hard to measure his different types with a traditional intelligence test, but that's his theory. And then you have the idea of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence combines inter and intrapersonal intelligence. So you're able to understand emotions for yourself and other people, show empathy, understand social relationships, and regulate your emotions. And there might be some people who say that this isn't really intelligence, but this is a better predictor of success than traditional intelligence tests. You are not going to do well in a work setting if you can't play well with others. So people with high emotional intelligence tend to be more successful in the business world than people who just have high IQ scores. And then we have the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, CHC. This is a theory of cognitive abilities. It's kind of the most comprehensive theory of intelligence that we currently have. And it has a hierarchy for abilities. You have your general ability on top. This is your intelligence. Then you have broad abilities in the middle. So this would involve things like your fluid intelligence, that fluid reasoning, your short-term memory, processing speed. And then finally at the bottom, you have narrow or specific abilities. These are the ones that can be directly measured with a test. So your specific forms of cognitive ability. For example, looking at broad versus narrow, if broad intelligence is your short-term memory, then your narrow abilities would be things like your memory span, your working memory capacity, things that are easier to measure. And then finally, before we get into measuring intelligence, we have creativity. This is your ability to generate, create, discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. And this is assessed as a function of your ability to engage in divergent thinking, where there are multiple solutions to one problem, versus convergent thinking, which is like your multiple choice tests, where there's one right solution. So divergent. If you have high creativity, you're better at divergent thinking. So how do we measure intelligence tests, or measure intelligence? The first person who created sort of a broad intelligence test was Sir Francis Galton in the early 1900s. And the first sort of reliable intelligence tests began with Binet. So Galton's test was not the most reliable. So Binet and Simon were the ones who created the first reliable intelligence test. It was in France. The French government was going to have universal education, free public school, and they wanted to be able to identify they needed help who hadn't been in school before. And so Binet and Simon or Simon, it's French, created the intelligence test to give to the school kids. And it was sort of revolutionary. And what the score you got from Binet's test was called mental age. And so it was, so if your mental age was 8, you were as smart as the average 8-year-old. And so you could be put in a class with 8-year-olds. If your mental age was 10, you were as smart as the average 10-year-old. And this was considered amazing, and Americans wanted it. So they translated the test from French to English, gave it to a bunch of American kids, and the American kids bonded. Because it turns out you couldn't just translate the words, you had to translate the concepts to something that was culturally American. And so Lewis Terman at Stanford University created the American version of this test. It's what we call the Stanford Binet. And Stanford, because Terman worked at Stanford, and Binet in honor of the person who did the first test. And then next we have Wechsler. David Wechsler combined several subtests from other intelligence tests that were used between the late 19th century and World War II, World War I. Intelligence testing sort of really took off in World War I because they wanted to test all of these military recruits to decide like what sort of job they should have. So he combined some of those original tests with some of the ones that were created during the war, and he created the Wechsler-Bellevue intelligence scale. And so this was one of the most extensively used intelligence tests in the history of psychology. He has 3 versions now. What was originally the Wechsler-Bellevue is now called the WAIS, which stands for Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's currently in its 4th edition. He created 2 other types. These are based on age. So the WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. This would be for kids who are between like 6 and 16. And then the WIPSI is the Wechsler Primary and Preschool Scale of Intelligence, which is for like 3 to 6 or 7. So all of these have Wechsler Intelligence Scale in the title. The A for adult, the C for children, and the PP for preschool and primary. That lets you know what age range it is. And for all these Wechsler tests, there's 5 different categories. You have verbal comprehension, visual spatial ability, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed, as well as a full scale of intelligence. And regardless of the test, whether it's Stanford Binet or Wechsler, they have to recalibrate the score, and that is because of the Flynn effect. So like every generation, they kind of have to change the scoring of it. The Flynn effect says that each generation has a significantly higher IQ than the last. It tends to go up about 5 points each generation, but the Flynn effect has just slowed down. Current generation not significantly smarter than the last, but generally speaking, it goes up. By the way, when we talk about the score, now you don't get a mental age score. Now the score you get is called your IQ. IQ was created by William Stern, and he was German. And it's an equation. Now, when he did it, it was a very simple equation. It's a lot more complex now, but it's still the same. The equation for IQ is mental age over chronological age times 100. So if your mental age is 8 and you're 8 years old, your IQ is 100. The average is 100. If you are 8, but your mental age is 12, your IQ is 150. You're technically in the gifted range. If you are 8, but your mental age is 6, then your IQ is 75, and you are going to be no, you're not in the intellectual disability category, but almost. So below 100, less smart than most people your age. Above 100, smarter than people your age. Again, we don't use that simple calculation to create IQ now because of the Flynn effect. They keep having to recalibrate, but the average still is 100. So let's talk about different forms of disability or giftedness. If you have intellectual disability, that is an IQ below 70. And there's 4 levels of it. If your IQ is between 50 and 69, this makes up 85% of people who have intellectual disability. That means you work as an adult, you're going to be kind of at the 3rd to 6th grade reading level. If you have a mild intellectual disability, you can hold a job, you can live independently. There might be minor complications, but you can generally lead a normal life. If you have moderate intellectual disability, your IQ is between 36 and 49. This is about 10% of people with intellectual disability. You have basic reading and writing, but it's 1st, 2nd grade level. You can take care of yourself, but you're going to need some oversight. So you're not going to be able to live fully independently. If you have severe intellectual disability, this is someone with an IQ between 20 and 35. Only 5%, just under 5% of people with intellectual disability fall into this category. You also have some functional self-care skills. You can do some things for yourself, but you have to have oversight in your daily environment, in your activities. You're going to have to live in a group home. You're going to have to be highly supervised if you have a job. And then finally, you have profound intellectual disability. And this is someone whose IQ is below 20. This is less than 1% of people with intellectual disability. Potentially you're able to communicate, but there is a chance that you're going to be nonverbal, unable to communicate, and you're going to have intensive oversight. You're not going to be able to take care of yourself. You're not going to be able to have a job. And if you are gifted, so people with intellectual disability only make up about just over 2% of people, 2.2%. That's the same for gifted. Only about 2% of people fall into the gifted range. You are gifted if your IQ is 130 or higher. So 30 points either way. 30 points under 100, the average 70, intellectual disability. 30 points above the average, 130, you are in the gifted range. There used to be an assumption that people who were gifted were maladjusted, more prone to psychological disorders, more prone to being weak. Actually, Louis Terman, who created the Stanford Binet, he had what he called Terman's termites. He studied gifted kids, and he found out, no, you're not more prone to things like psychological disorders if you're gifted. You tend to turn out pretty normal. So what causes your intelligence? Is it genes or is it environment? So question for you, which one do you think has more of an effect on what your intelligence score is? Is it genes or environment? It's mostly genes. So genes matter more than environment. Genes can have an effect, or environment can have some effect, but genes play a big role. A big reason we know this is looking at adoption studies, looking at kids who are adopted and comparing their intelligence scores to their adoptive parents and their biological parents. And as they get older, it's more similar to their biological parents. But again, if you remember back to chapter 3, this connects with range of reaction. That your genes give you a potential range, but then it's your environment that determines where in that range you're going to fall. So you can get intelligent genes from your parents, and if you also have a healthy environment, you will get towards the top of your ability. If you have a not so great environment, it'll be towards the lower end. So for example, I'll use my father as an example. My father has a fairly high IQ. He has a doctorate and 3 masters. He's a big nerd. He has a high IQ score. And again, genes play a part in that. So part of it was the GGOT, like from his father. My grandfather dropped out of high school in 9th grade when he was 18 years old. So he was an 18-year-old 9th grader and dropped out to enlist. He would not do really well on an intelligence test. But his genes helped contribute to my father's. A big part of that, how they could have similar genes but such drastically different IQ scores, is environmental. It's not just because of the genes my father got from his mother as well, because my grandmother dropped out in 8th grade. But they had horrible environments. My grandfather was raised on a farm with 12 siblings. His school was horrible. They only taught each grade every other year. My grandmother had to drop out in 8th grade to become a waitress in New York City. They weren't given a healthy environment to reach the top of their IQ range. They were able to give my father a better environment, so he was able to get a higher IQ score. So yes, genes play a part, but environment plays an important part as well. Arthur Jensen would focus only on the genetic component. Disclaimer, I don't like Arthur Jensen at all. He says that IQ is only determined by genes, and he says there is genetic differences based on race. So he says that you have 2 types of abilities. You have your rote memorization, so your ability to memorize stuff, and all ethnic groups are the same in that. It says there's a level 2, which is your analytic ability, and he says that there are ethnic differences genetically in how good you can be on that type of intelligence. So Asian populations would be at the top, Caucasian in the middle, Africans at the bottom. A lot of people, myself included, think that his theories are racist and don't bear out as well when you look at environmental causes in differences in scores, IQ scores based on ethnicity. So for example, a lot of the original intelligence tests created in the US were created by urban white, northern, rich dudes. And so the people who did best on those intelligence tests were northern, white, urban, rich dudes. And so if you were raised in the South, if you were raised in rural areas, if you were not white, if you were not male, you didn't do as well. That's not necessarily a sign of your intelligence. That's a sign of who created the intelligence test. When you create what we call culture fair tests, which are tests that take out things like language, take out things like cultural differences, then you don't see a difference as much in the intelligence scores for people based on their location, based on their upbringing, based on their ethnicity. So Jensen kind of gets it wrong. Final thing to go over for this chapter, and then we'll be done. Sorry, this is slightly longer, but it's the only one for this chapter. No other videos. Is learning disabilities. There are a few you should know. In general, learning disabilities. Oh, let me make this move. Okay. You go down here. Learning disabilities are cognitive disorders that affect different areas of cognition, usually language or reading. They are neurological impairments. They are not intellectual disabilities. So just because you have a learning disability, that says absolutely nothing about your intelligence. 3, you should know. Dysgraphia, which is a difficulty in writing legibly. Dyslexia, which is when you have difficulty processing letters. This is the most common learning disability in children, is dyslexia. And then you have dyscalculia, which is a difficulty in comprehending arithmetic. You have trouble with your numbers. And that is it for learning disabilities, and that is it for this chapter.